So I want to urge us all when we're talking about this to really specify in which sectors, in which areas, and to what degree U.S. power has declined. So it's not across economics and markets and counterterrorism, military. What do we really mean by this?
We can see that the main source of Chinese regional policies is mostly grounded on anti-hegemonic strategy. So basically, everything that somehow can dilute, weaken the influence of the U.S. in the region is, a good political gain and falls within this approach to Chinese regional strategy.
These were, if you like, the slogans that we were trying to unpack. But more specifically, to look at agency, we are very interested in regional power responses to systemic shift, to, in particular, the changing power dynamics between the United States and China. Why these two? Why this sub-region? Answer is very straightforward. This sub-region, in many ways, sits at the heart of global dynamics. It's not just about energy. It's about geopolitics. It's about geoeconomics. It's about connectivity. What happens to this small region of the world affects much of the world, but also it's the way in which major powers, great powers, interact with this region that was of interest to us. And we could sense a process of change going on.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Today we're going to resume our discussion about China's rapidly evolving role in the Persian Gulf and the wider Middle East. Now, you may remember from a couple of weeks ago, we spoke with Israeli scholar Gedalia Afterman for what was a fascinating discussion about China's role in the region, and we looked at it, of course, with him from an Israeli perspective. Now, those of you who have been following the show over the past year or so know that we've covered this from a number of different angles, looking at it from both Arab and Persian Gulf countries' points of view. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to those episodes and our discussion with Gedalia, I highly recommend it, in part because one of the constant themes that we keep coming back to is this question of the competition between the U.S. and China for influence in the region. And that's where we're going to drill down even further today. Earlier this year, the academic journal Middle East Policy published a special issue dedicated to the Persian Gulf and the U.S.-China rivalry. 3 editors put this issue together, and some of them you may even be familiar with. Andrea Ghiselli, who's been on our show a number of times over the past few years, and he's also an assistant professor at Fudan University in Shanghai. Also, Enrico Fardella, who's an associate professor at the University of Naples. We've also had on our show in the past before. And a new voice for us, Professor Anoushiravan Ehteshami, the Nasser Al-Mohammed Al-Sabah Chair in International Relations at Durham University in the UK. So these 3 pulled together some of the top scholars in the world who focused on China-Mideast ties to explore all aspects of this incredibly complex topic. Altogether, there were 9 essays in the journal that explored how countries like Iraq, Iran, the UAE, and Israel are all navigating the great power rivalry. They also delved into China's historical ties in the region and how the U.S. is recalibrating its policies in the Gulf in response to China's growing presence. Earlier, I had a chance to speak with Andrea, Enrico, and Anoush during a seminar that I hosted with them as part of the launch of this special edition of Middle East Policy. The discussion was so interesting that I asked them if it would be possible to share some of the highlights of the discussion with you on the show today. And so today, what we're going to do is play some of those clips of our discussion that we had during this webinar. And we really want to find out more about how this special issue came together. And for that, what we did is we started off our discussion with Adam Joyce, who's the editor of Middle East Policy.
The issue does what the title says it does. It lays out how these regional states are adjusting to a different type of order. And of course, you'll find in the case studies, so we have from the UAE to Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and other key states, they're very different power dynamics within the region. It's affect how they are interacting. And I'll get to where I think that one of the most interesting contributions right at the end. But I did want to, organize my remarks thematically, and these themes I've already touched on, so I'll try not to take up too much of your time. But I do think that there are three assumptions that can plague scholarship. So if those of you in the room who are working on these issues, I highly recommend 3 points. We should not overstate past American hegemony or its apparent contemporary decline. We should temper assumptions about the rise of China and the dynamics involved there. And that we shouldn't see the Middle Eastern states simply as navigating between two poles, but as agents acting according to their interests. And in one particularly interesting article in the issue, not just their actions inside the region, but actually their activities around the world. So on the question, and I could go on at length about this, about whether we're seeing this decline of U.S. hegemony or an era of the decline of Pax Americana. I mean, I always try to emphasize that I just think that we're making a big mistake interpreting the post-Cold War order as one of unparalleled hegemony. I know that that organizes the thinking of some of the states in the region, but I think that sometimes the submissions that I receive that discuss the contemporary order sometimes internalize this complaint from the region and accept it without question. They too often state as fact that the United States is abandoning the region, or that its hegemony has declined, or that the era of Pax Americana is over. There's no question that U.S. influence is on the wane. There are a lot of reasons for that. But I wouldn't reify the previous American order as, it's being an unquestioned hegemon for 20 years. I could go through the whole list from the Persian Gulf War onward, but as we can see, just even from the post-Persian Gulf War, the United States spent a decade bombing Iraq. It quickly took down Saddam's regime, but it demonstrated its inability to shape a sustainable nation, its susceptibility to terrorism, its willingness to countenance ethnic cleansing in exchange for calm. And that leaves out the whole larger strategic blunder, as the Saudis put it, of the U.S. handing Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. So I want to urge us all, when we're talking about this, to really specify in which sectors, in which areas, and to what degree U.S. power has declined. So it's not across economics and markets and counterterrorism, military, and also what do we really mean by this? And on that point, I can commend to you 2 articles. One that's been discussed by Professors Ehteshami and Ghiselli. We probably have disagreements about U.S. influence in the region, but I think their framing of this away from unipolarity and into another form of order is absolutely the correct one. And then in Rachel Moreland's contribution, she examines how the United States is adjusting to China's increase in economic and diplomatic activity in the region. She suggests that the United States should not, and probably does not, see this as a zero-sum game, because there are a lot of areas where actually in the region, the United States can actually pursue its interests by cooperating with China and can advance its interests in that way. The second point was not to overstate China's rise. I mean, the activity and creativity of Chinese actions in the Middle East is absolutely impressive and effective. And while it appears to be mostly economic, there's major strategic elements as well, the Belt and Road Initiative. And all of this together suggests how ill-considered the U.S. approach to the Middle East and Africa has been. But it's not clear how sustainable and straightforward the Chinese arrangements are, given the volatility of the region. What are the costs that it will bear as it moves forward? It's not simply benefits. And, is China able to build on the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Can it build out from the bilateral economic-based diplomacy and create a durable framework that increases its global reach and power and does not bog it down into the regional conflicts that can be so costly? And here, I think the key article is Fardella, and they showed that it's just not a simple story, that there's a lot of continuity there. We get a sense from their article about how China is shaping regional dynamics away from the hegemonic influence of traditional powers like the United States. That's a direct quote. We get a sense of what they refer to as the longue durée of Beijing's strategy, but also the potential for Middle East countries to really follow that path that was envisioned long ago by Matt. And then point 3, I apologize, just one more minute. let's really focus on the agency of these states. For those of you working on China's interests and actions in the Middle East, consider how the regional states are advancing their interests by playing the two sides off against each other, not just that they're simply reacting and moving from one form of domination to another form of domination. So try not to stick just with the surface evidence for shifts toward one power and away from the other. There are sophisticated moves being made here. So we have an article on the theoretical side by Hannah Santini and Wolser. They take us through theories that developed to explain the regional orders during and after the Cold War. And they frame the U.S., quote, abandonment as a perception driven by Obama's withdrawal of support from Mubarak. But more important, and I really commend this article to you, they focus on the many shifts in building order within the region, not just the binary decline of U.S. power or rise of China, but really how the states themselves were shifting orders across the Cold War and into the post-Cold War period. And then finally, on the empirical side, a really impressive article by Al-Farhan and Al-Sudari. They provide a model for scholars to shake up the question of how states navigate the United States and China. Even those who examine the strategies of individual states often see those states as simply acting within the region. But Al-Farhan and Al-Sudari analyze how sovereign wealth funds of GCC member states have invested in China's equity market. So they're showing not just that these actions between the U.S. and China are taking place locally, but the actors themselves are acting outside of the region. So what they look at is the data showing the increase of investment in the equity market, also the diversification of those investments. And the authors suggest that this can deepen ties with China in a way that provides some alternatives to dollar hegemony, although not necessarily spelling the complete end to it. From that, I think we can, suggest that we should be looking at not at moving from one order to another order, but potentially overlapping or simultaneously existing orders.
Now, one of the key themes that often emerges in any discussion about the role of the U.S. and China in the Persian Gulf is the perception that China's influence is rising while American power is on the decline. Andrea made it very clear those narratives are way too binary.
We're not saying that the United States is declining and everything is changing immediately or so quickly. We're interested, however, to look at how, in any case, a different perception of power, right, are shaping the behavior of different regional actors, as well as China, which was really my contribution. Being a Middle East politics expert myself, I focus more on the China's perception of the story, which I think is quite interesting, especially if you look at how the differences, right, how the Americans and the Chinese look at the same dynamics and the problems that they face in responding to those dynamics, especially as it seems to me that they face somewhat interesting questions, though in a way they complement each other, we can say. On one hand, you have the Chinese that have a lot of possibilities in front of them. They have the economic leverage. Many countries have expectations, more or less overblown expectations about Chinese, some kind of intervention, diplomatic intervention in the region. But they're still asking themselves, what should we do in the very first place? There's a question of what to do, not how to do it, because probably they wouldn't know maybe how to do it. Or maybe there's a question that can come later. They're still asking themselves what to do, especially with the United States that is not less powerful, simply distracted mostly. It's focused on many issues, but it's still the most powerful, really, actor in the region. And that is not going to change for the time being, at least for some time. On the other hand, you have the Americans that clearly know what to do. They clearly have set their priorities containing China in the region. The problem is how to do it at this point. So kind of different. The two actors face different questions. One knows the answer to one, but not the other. Then the other power knows the answer to the other, but not to the one. And I think this is really important because I think it adds that nuance that we need to think, right? As you said, it's not just powers going up, going down. But I think it's really important to understand also how that power or those changing power dynamics are then utilized and what kind of strategies they fuel and what kind of strategies can be implemented based on that. So in our paper, Anoush and I tried to address that, trying to give a framework to the special issue, trying to set the contours in a way to the US-China relations, US-China dynamics, and then let the others in the other papers to play with that, look at the same dynamics, the same changes in order to see how those other actors then look at them from different perspectives.
Listen, there's no debate that for a long time, the U.S. was the undisputed hegemonic power in the Persian Gulf. That was the case for a number of years after the end of the Cold War in the early 90s. But those days are now over. And not just because of the arrival of the Chinese, but also the rise of regional powers that Andrea says have ushered in a new era of multipolarity.
In a way, unipolarity is clear, right? There's one guy that is recognized as the strongest in the pack, and that's it. No challenge, no ambiguity, that's it. Multipolarity is ambiguous by nature, which means different people can interpret it, can feel it as they see fit. And I think this is what we're seeing, essentially what Anoush was saying. China's, in a way, increasing footprint or influence, you can choose the term you like, is happening in that context, which gives space to regional policymakers to interpret it as they see fit and to utilize it, most importantly, to achieve their goals.
A lot of you may be thinking that the end of unipolarity and the rise of multipolarity is not a phenomenon that's unique to the Persian Gulf. We're seeing it happen here in Southeast Asia. It's taking place in Latin America, basically pretty much everywhere. But what's driving that transformation of the international order, particularly in a place like the Gulf, is still not very well understood. And Anoush makes the case that Persian Gulf countries started to look east as more of their economic interests were in Asia rather than the U.S. or Europe.
It was a very interesting exercise, trying to analyze the continuity of Chinese foreign policy and how this continuity applies to the region that we're looking at, the Persian Gulf. So, generally speaking, going back to what we said before about China and the U.S., decline, ascent. If you look at the debate, the rise of China is often framed both as a cause and an effect of the Western decline. And the Middle East is a region where this kind of perception manifests, as we said before, more evidently, right? So in the last 10 years, you have seen a blossoming of scholarly interest in this phenomenon, so Chinese regional policy in the Middle East. The problem that I find, generally speaking, in this scholarship, excellent scholarship indeed, but it's mostly focused on quantitative analysis, namely loans, investment, infrastructure, and this, of course, implies an overemphasis on change. So post-Mao China, the rise of China, economic China, and, so sort of like the spillover of this Chinese economic force and strength into this region as much as in other regions. So the problem is that this excessive emphasis on change versus continuity risks to confuse tactics, in my opinion, with strategy, and risk to interpret actions irrespective of intentions. So the idea that we had with Xi Jinping was trying to reconnect Beijing's regional policy within the longue durée, the continuity of China's traditional foreign policy strategy, which is basically rooted in Mao Zedong, the anti-hegemonic strategy, what was called at the time intermediate zone theory, something that, as we said in introduction, is not very much analyzed in Western scholarship. Except a couple of cases, the most important author that we are trying, it's like basically the main source of our inspiration. It's Shikor, that wrote his PhD at the end of the 1970s, the first very, in my opinion, at least, in the most, instructive volume on China policy in the Middle East. And so what is the main conclusion of this? I'm not going to analyze the Mao Zedong intermediate zone theory and anti-hegemonic strategy, because I don't want to bother you and our audience, but, you can look at the paper. It's actually the most substantial part of the paper itself. But what matters is the fact that eventually this historical analysis meets a lot of prominent Chinese scholar analysis. One among the others, Niu Xinqun, who is one of the major, analysts on Chinese policy in the Middle East. And basically the idea is that this resilience of this tradition of anti-hegemonic strategy in China regional policies has so far prevented Beijing from developing a more independent and assertive regional policy. So namely, to make a long story short, we can see that the main source of Chinese regional policies is mostly grounded on anti-hegemonic strategy. So basically, everything that somehow can dilute, weaken the influence of the US in the region is a good political gain and falls within this approach to Chinese regional strategy. There is, in the conclusion, we emphasize potential transition into this continuity, a transition that can be genetical to a certain extent, because the Sino-American rivalry, which is in the title of the special issue, as much as the perceived decline of the US hegemony, which has been, getting stronger and stronger in China, especially after the Lehman Brothers crisis. There is a lot of, discussion about it, but certainly this is an important factor in terms of perception, as much as the growing relevance of the Persian Gulf, the Middle East per se, but in particular the Persian Gulf, in global politics may influence the future of China's regional approach. How? Well, we can see a sort of attempt to depart from this traditional form of what we could call proactive defense, as expressed in the logic of anti-hegemonic strategy, into an unprecedented role that combines the newly acquired centrality that China is gaining at the global level, and especially in the region, with the traditional forms of dominion. I mean, the paper itself is an interesting intellectual exercise, but at the same time, closes with this question mark that may inspire future research by both me and Shiganje.
Just very quickly, is this anti-hegemonic philosophy that you're seeing in the Persian Gulf and that you were writing about, is that something unique to this region, or does this apply to Chinese foreign policy writ large around the world?
No, well, actually, this is something that I saw unfolding in the paper. I tried to point out the key passages evolution of the intermediate zone theory from 1946 onward through all the different variations of this theory, all the way to Xi Jinping Belt and Road Initiative, that somehow we see at the newest manifestation of this sort of geopolitical vision. But, something that in my previous research, for example, I appreciate the way how this global strategy was localizing itself, especially when it came to Europe. I made a different publication on China's policy towards Europe, and you see, for example, a concept of differentiation. So basically how China anti-hegemonic strategy was being localized at country level, region by region, according to that country position vis-a-vis the hegemon. So let's say France, after 1964, when France recognized China, the first, NATO member to recognize China in 1964, that was obviously, required a sort of strong investment in the direction, because it was emphasizing or amplifying the contradiction in the enemy front, to use Maoist vocabulary. So, the same kind of strategy and tactics, I think, that resonates very much in the way how China operates in the region. So I think that we can appreciate better change if we keep in mind the continuity. If we actually forget about the continuity and we always focus on change, I think we risk to lose focus.
And Anoush made one point in particular that was especially salient for this show about how the arrival of China in the Persian Gulf provided countries with a choice they didn't have during the unipolar moment when the U.S. was the lone dominant power.
For me in particular, the question was about systemic shift. We talk about systemic shift. We talk about the way in which the weight of the global economy is going eastwards, going towards Asia. If you put a pin on it now, it's on the border of China and India. This has happened in less than 100 years, indeed less than 50 years, when it was actually on the borders of Europe and the United States. So how does this happen? We talk about it, but we don't actually look under the skin of it, Eric. So the project was to understand this from three, if you like, slogans. The first one is everybody has a look east policy. What does look east mean when you're sitting in West Asia, right? Indeed, even India has a look east policy. What does look east means to an Asian country? First. The second slogan is everybody uses is America's Asia pivot. The West Asian region, Persian Gulf, is in Asia. What did the United States, what did Obama mean by Asia pivot when it became more of a policy than a mantra? The third is the question of China's look west policy. Remember, while everybody else is looking east, China has now developed a look west policy. What does a look west policy mean in this context? So these were, if you like, the slogans that we were trying to unpack. But more specifically, to look at agency. We were very interested in regional power responses to systemic shift, to, in particular, the changing power dynamics between the United States and China. Why these two? Why this sub-region? Answer is very straightforward. This sub-region, in many ways, sits at the heart of global dynamics. It's not just about energy. It's about geopolitics. It's about geoeconomics. It's about connectivity. What happens to this small region of the world affects much of the world, but also it's the way in which major powers, great powers, interact with this region that was of interest to us. And we could sense a process of change going on. They talk about look east, America talk about Asia pivot, China talk about look west, but what did it mean in practical terms? And the only way to understand that, of course, was to begin to look at the regional powers themselves. What is their response? How do they manage this relationship, right? Of course, we weren't only focused on the pro-Western countries because that would make it too much of a simple analysis. We're interested in a crop of countries. So our case studies, we selected prominent experts in each of these places to give us insights, and we gave them a brief in terms of what it is that we wanted them to unpack for us. So we looked at Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, Iraq, and to a lesser extent, Kuwait. We commissioned these experts to tell us what Look East means from each of their perspectives. And secondly, to try and tell us where do they sit in relation to the United States and China interactions, rivalries, and so on. We didn't buy into this American decline idea because, in fact, what we wanted to look at, how is the relationship with the two now resident powers changing? Our interest wasn't in so much what the Americans thought of themselves. Our interest was much more in what the regional powers thought of America, thinking what it thinks of itself. And in fact, we had a whole paper that looks at America's position with regard to the Persian Gulf and where China features in that. So we were much more interested in what do American allies in UAE and Saudi Arabia make of America's own self-definitions first, or do Americans' rivals, Iran and China, make of America's self-declared reorientation? And what is a country like Iraq, that until 30 years ago was one of the greatest powers in the Arab region, is now so diminished that it cannot actually make up its mind about systemic shift, about changing power dynamics between the United States and China, but it's actually dependent on both of them. So the 4 case studies were chosen to highlight precisely the complexity of power shifts. And they are now, in our paper, had long discussions over different time zones about, do we mean really about American decline? No, we don't. Do we mean that China is becoming dominant? No, we don't. And we grapple with these issues throughout our own discussions. So the issue was put together not on the premise that America is declining, China is rising, therefore let's look at this. It was put together on the premise that the perceptions of changing relations between the United States and China is manifesting itself in regional systems. And the one region, sub-region, that this becomes a really interesting, important issue is the Persian Gulf.
The problem for a lot of people who look at China's growing presence in the Persian Gulf is that they see what's directly in front of them, and they look at the deals, the loans, the high-level visits. What they're missing, according to Enrico, is the historical context.
What you're seeing is exercise of agency. It's not just here. It's, if you like, it's a global South awakening that appeals to your project, Eric, in many ways. Yeah. And some of these countries, particularly the ones who've been so closely tied to the West, are beginning to exercise. And why are they able to exercise? Because they have new opportunity. Because China's soft power message of win-win resonates very differently from you must democratize or you must liberalize. It is a different set of...
Or human rights and issues of human rights and things like that.
A different set of perceptions that allows them to become more autonomous actors. It's the exercise of autonomous power, which is what was really driving our interest.
And just before we wrapped up our discussion, I asked Andrea, Enrico, and Anoush to share a few final thoughts on the experience of editing this special edition and what they want people to focus on when thinking about the U.S.-China rivalry in the Persian Gulf. Let's first start with Andrea.
If we look at the Chinese debate today, there are people that say we should go back to something that we have been doing before. But then in a way, the historic reference changed. There's this great article published recently by Yu Xinchun that kind of gives an overview of the Chinese debate and how to address the U.S. problems in the Middle East. And he says, there are some people that say the current policy is working. And so we just stick to it. Just focus on economy, keep our principal stance. Of course, people can debate forever the principal part, and just let the Americans make the blunders and things will work out. And then you see others instead of say, no, we need to address directly the United States and this new strategy of containment that connects East Asia to the Middle East and other parts of the world against us. And it's interesting that Yu Xinchun said in this article, this means going back to the Cold War. This means, reopening our kind of policy menu from the Cold War and readopt this. So we started to invest more in political, diplomatic, maybe military relations also in the region. And I think especially now with the war in Gaza and so on, different people look at the same facts and they can find easy arguments for both calling for change and for continuity. Like some say, this is another American blunder, and our just taking a stance and sticking to it is working out. These countries in the Middle East, including Israel in the long term, will come back to looking at East, which means looking at us. And we just don't have to do anything. The Americans will contain themselves. Other instead might say, no, this is actually the moment to go in and really keep the American bleeding as much as possible, distract them, inflict any damage that we can. And so, again, is this continuity or change? Again, I think it really depends on your historical reference. If your historical reference is the Deng Xiaoping era, then this is clear change. But if you go back earlier to the Mao era, no, this is actually going back to the past. There's much more continuity to this. And so we see today's events prompting these debates, and people look at the past looking for answers. But I don't think there's a clear answer yet. If not that, it's a very dangerous and costly gambit, whatever direction Chinese policy takes.
For Enrico, context is key.
Of course, I have to sell my paper, and so I say that continuity to me has like a more realistic glory than change. But of course, to use also Chinese discourse, they coexist, the dialectic of the two things. And the concept of anti-hegemony applied to a regional level basically means trying to invest political capital, economic capital into blunting U.S. order in the region. But this is continuity. Change is building a new order. So the question would be, can we see, and I think we can see, the first step into China trying to build a new order in the region, not so that something that goes beyond the traditional anti-hegemonic strategy that was mostly addressed in blunting the American order. And I think this is actually where we have to look at. There is a very interesting report recently published by the Atlantic Council on the promotion of authoritarian governance in the Global South. And I think that is based on a very interesting set of sources that are coming from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. And I think that, you can certainly see that there are like some new forms of order that may emerge from this shift from continuity and change. But of course, as I said before, this is just the beginning of a very long research line that we may want to develop together.
And it was fitting that we closed the discussion with some remarks by Anoush, who reminded everyone that it's the stakeholders themselves in the Persian Gulf countries who are the most consequential in this new rivalry. Not the Chinese, not the Americans.
This is a multi-layer order. This is not one or the other. It's not about, if you like, multipolarity. It's about multi-layerity. And it's in the multi-layerity that we begin to see state agency. That here, state agency really matters. You're dealing with a bunch of countries that are either unelected or elections are justifications for continuity of authoritarianism. How that plays out is really important because it leaves the choices to a small elite. Next, it helps you to understand what makes global South countries tick. How do they exercise not policies, but policy options? You see this in the paper, for example, on the UAE. You see the paper, for example, on Iraq, the dilemmas that these elites are now having to deal with. And finally, again, everything that we've done in this hour and we do in this special issue is to show that for all the journalistic characterization of power shifts and so on, it is not a zero-sum game. Certainly not when it comes to the behavior and perceptions of regional actors from this strategic region itself.
Well, let's leave the conversation there. I want to thank Andrea Ghiselli, an assistant professor at Fudan University in Shanghai, Enrico Fardella, associate professor at the University of Naples. And it's important to note that both Andrea and Enrico are part of the fantastic China Med project at the University of Torino in Italy. And if you'd like to follow their work, you can follow it at chinamed.it. And also, they publish their fantastic China Med Observer on our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. You can read that without accessing the paywall, so I highly recommend that. And of course, a big thank you to Professor Anoushiravan Ehteshami, the Nasser Al-Mohammed Al-Sabah Chair in International Relations at Durham University. And of course, last but not least, Middle East Policy Editor Adam Joyce, who put this all together and provided some excellent introductory remarks for us to set up our discussion today. And if you'd like to read the special issue of the journal, you'll of course have to find it at a library, most likely a university or a government library. And if you have online access, well, I'll put the link below in the show notes so you can access it there. I highly recommend it. These articles are fascinating. So that'll do it for this edition of the China Global South podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. We'll be back to our usual format that's more interview and discussion formats, but I did want to kind of shake it up a little bit and bring you some of these academic discussions that oftentimes don't make it into the public realm. So again, would love to hear what you think of this format and if you have any feedback about whether or not this is something you want us to do more of in the future. So until next week, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.